The radio in my hand said 10 minutes. The man on the other end said it twice, like he didn't believe it either. And then he said the part that still wakes me up at 3 in the morning. He said the bird seats 4. And there are 5 of you, and I can't change the math, sir. I'm sorry, I can't change the math. I was standing in the stairwell of a parking garage on the east side of Cedar Falls, Iowa, with my wife pressing a folded shirt against the side of my son's head because he'd split it open on a guardrail an hour before. And I was looking at the 4 faces I loved most in the world while a voice told me to subtract 1. The concrete around us still held the day's heat. There was a smear of my son's blood on the shirt, dark and going darker. And the radio's little speaker hissed between the man's sentences. And somewhere below us, in the dark of that garage, something dragged itself across the floor in no hurry at all. Because the dead have nowhere to be. I'm going to tell you exactly how I got there, and exactly what I did. Because for 11 months, I told nobody. And the silence almost finished what the outbreak started. My name is Wendell Garza. I was 48 that autumn. I spent 22 years as a lineman for the Regional Power Cooperative, which means I climbed poles in ice storms and crawled through substations that hummed like something alive and learned the one thing that ended up mattering most. When a system starts to fail, it doesn't fail all at once. It fails in a sequence. A relay trips, which loads the next circuit, which overheats, which trips the one after it. And if you're standing in the right place with the right knowledge, you can watch the whole thing come down, in your head, a full minute before it comes down in the world. And if you can read the sequence, sometimes you can stay one step ahead of it. I couldn't stay ahead of this. Nobody could. But I want to be honest with you about every choice, even the ones I'd give anything to take back. Before I go further, I just want to say thank you to the people who keep coming back to these stories. And welcome if this is your first time sitting with me. If grounded survival stories like this are your kind of thing, stay with the channel, leave a comment, and let me know you're out there. It genuinely keeps these going. Now let me take you back to the morning. Everything started coming apart because the 10 minutes in that stairwell didn't come out of nowhere. They were the last link in a chain I'd been watching break for 9 days. It started for me with the lights, not the lights going out. That came later, and that part everyone remembers. What I remember is the lights staying on when they shouldn't have. I was on a call-out the morning of the 4th, a transformer fault out on County Road Fee near the Wapsipinicon, the kind of routine fault I'd cleared 1,000 times. And the dispatcher kept routing me to addresses that already had power. I'd roll up in the bucket truck, diesel idling, and the meter on the side of the house would be spinning like it was running an air conditioner in July. And the porch light would be burning in broad daylight, yellow and useless against the morning sun. And nobody would answer the door. 3 houses in a row. By the 4th, I stopped knocking. There was a smell I didn't have a word for yet. Coming from under a screen door, something sweet underneath something rotten. A smell that got into the back of your throat and stayed there, and a sound from inside that was rhythmic and wet and wrong. A slow, soft thudding like someone bumping the same piece of furniture over and over in a dark room. And every instinct I'd built over 2 decades of walking onto strange properties, into junkyards with bad dogs and trailers with bad people, told me to get back in the truck. I remember standing on that 4th porch with my hand raised to knock and just lowering it, slow, and backing down the steps without turning my back on the door, the way you back away from a snake. I called it in. My supervisor, a heavy-set man named Otho Brandt, who'd hired me when I was 26, and had never once raised his voice in all the years I'd known him, told me to finish the route. I told him there was something wrong at these addresses, something I couldn't put a name to, that the houses had power they shouldn't have, and people inside who wouldn't come out. He went quiet for a second. I could hear him breathing. And I could hear, in the background of his end, another phone ringing, and nobody picking it up. And then he said, "Yeah, we're hearing that." And the way he said it, flat, careful, like a man stepping around something on the floor in the dark, choosing where to put his feet, that was the first time I felt the ground move under me. Otho Brandt was not a man who got rattled. I'd seen him direct a crew through a tornado restoration without his voice climbing once. And he was rattled. By the time I drove home that evening, the radio stations were running emergency tones over music that hadn't been pulled yet. So you'd get a perky little jingle, some local car dealership singing about no money down. And then the long, flat electronic tone. And then a robot voice telling you to remain indoors and await further instructions. The light over the city had gone strange. A thick gold that I told myself was just the season, but that felt, even then, like the light before a storm that never breaks. There was smoke somewhere east, a single column of it standing up over the river. And traffic on the bridges I could see was stopped, just stopped. Cars sitting at angles like someone had walked away from all of them at once. My wife, Marisol, was on the porch with her phone in both hands and a look on her face I'd seen exactly once before, the night her mother died. She's a labor and delivery nurse at Sartori, the hospital downtown. 16 years on the floor, a woman who has caught babies with the cord around their necks and kept her voice low, and even the whole time. And she'd come home early, which she never did. Never. In 16 years, I could count on one hand the shifts she'd left before her relief showed up. She had her scrubs still on, the blue ones, and there was something on the cuff of one sleeve she kept not looking at. She said the ER had taken in 11 people that afternoon with bite wounds, animal bites they thought at first, and 4 of them had coded on the tables, gone flatline, and 2 of the 4 had gotten up. She said the word up, and then stopped, like the word had a hook in it, gotten up off the table with the monitors still screaming, and the lines still in their arms. I want to be precise about what we did and didn't know, because hindsight makes everyone look stupid, and I don't want to lie to you. We did not know it was an outbreak in the way you've heard 100 times. We knew people were getting sick, getting violent, and not staying down. We knew the hospitals were filling, and then, worse, emptying. The staff not showing for the next shift. We did not know how fast it moved through a body once the fever took, or that it moved through the bite, and only the bite, the saliva in the wound. Or that the dead didn't decompose the way the dead are supposed to, that they'd keep on the same the second week as the first, drying instead of rotting, like something cured rather than something dead. Those were lessons we learned later, each one paid for in a way I'll get to. What I did know was electricity and water, and how a city actually works under the skin of it. The buried lines and the pump stations and the lift stations and the substations, the whole nervous system that keeps a place alive and that nobody thinks about until it stops. And that knowledge is the only reason any of us made it as far as that stairwell. We had 2 kids in the house. Our daughter Pilar was 16, sharp-tongued and braver than she had any right to be. The kind of kid who argues with you precisely because she's scared and won't show it. Who'll pick a fight about curfew when what she really wants is to know you'll be there. She had her grandmother's dark eyes and a way of going dead quiet when something truly frightened her. And I'd learned over the years that her silence was the alarm bell, not her noise. Our son, Tobias, was 11, asthmatic since he was 4. The gentle one, the one who named the spiders in the garage instead of killing them. There was a fat brown one, over the workbench he called Mr. Pemberton, and would not let me sweep down. And there was a fifth person under our roof that week, which is the detail the radio man couldn't change the math around. My father-in-law, Esteban, 73, who'd had a stroke the spring before and walked with a cane and a slow drag of the left foot. The toe of his left shoe always scuffed worse than the right from where it caught the ground. He was not a burden. I want that on the record before I say another word. Esteban Reyes was the most useful man in a crisis I have ever known. And the reason for that becomes important, so hold on to it. He'd moved in with us in March after the stroke, and at first it had been hard. 2 households folding into one, the small frictions of it. But by autumn he was part of the architecture of the place. He fixed things I never got to. He sat with Tobias when the boy's chest was bad, and the inhaler scared him. He and Pilar argued about everything, loudly, with great enjoyment, in 2 languages. The first 3 days, we stayed home. That was the right call, and I'd make it again. The cooperative had me on emergency standby, which in practice meant nobody was answering the phone at the office anymore. So I stopped trying after the second day, after the line just rang into nothing where Otho's voice should have been. I rationed what we had. I filled the tub and every pot and bucket and pitcher in the house the first night, because I knew that municipal water pressure is maintained by pumps, and pumps need power, and the power was going to go. I knew it the way you know weather in your knees. It went on the second night. Not a flicker, not a brownout, just gone. The refrigerator's hum dying mid-cycle and the whole house dropping into a silence, so total I could hear the kids breathing in their rooms. I'd already shut our main breaker by then, to protect the panel from the surges I knew were coming as the grid tore itself apart. Substation by substation, exactly the way I'd watched smaller failures cascade my whole career. When you take a region down ungracefully, the way this one was going down, you get voltage swings that'll cook everything plugged into a wall. And I wanted my house intact for whatever came next. When the neighbors' houses went dark, and ours had already been dark for a day, Marisol asked me how I knew. She asked it in the dark of our bedroom, both of us lying awake listening to the city. I told her I didn't know. Not really. I just knew the sequence. A relay trips, which loads the next circuit. I'd been reading that sequence for 22 years. The only difference now was that nobody was coming to reset anything. The thing nobody tells you about a city dying is how loud it is at first and how quiet it gets. The first 2 days there were sirens, constantly, layered over each other, coming from every direction at once, so you couldn't point to any one of them. And gunshots that were single and spaced out like someone making decisions. One, a pause, another. Choices being made in houses up and down the river. By the 4th day, the sirens had stopped because there was no one left to drive them. And the gunshots came in long, ragged bursts that meant panic. Magazines emptied at things that don't stop for bullets. And then those stopped too. And the not hearing them was worse than the hearing. By the 5th day, the loudest thing in our neighborhood was the wind moving through trees that nobody would ever rake under again, and a kind of low collective sound underneath it. A dragging, shuffling murmur with no edges to it. That I realized, after a long time of trying not to realize, it was the sound of a great many people who were no longer people, moving through the streets with no particular destination, the way water moves downhill, finding the low places. We learned to be silent. That was Esteban's lesson, oddly, the man who couldn't walk quietly teaching the rest of us how. He'd grown up in a place and a time he didn't talk about much, somewhere south, during years when the wrong sound at the wrong time got your family taken in the night. And he had a stillness in him the rest of us had to learn from scratch. He taught Tobias to breathe through his nose, slow, in for 4 and out for 4. Even when the inhaler was running low and his chest was tight as a drum, because the click and hiss of that inhaler carried in the silence, and the things outside came toward sound the way moths come toward light. He taught Pilar to step on the outside edges of her feet on the stairs, where the treads don't flex and creak. He sat by the front window for hours, not moving, a still shape in the gloom behind the curtain, watching the street. And when he raised one finger, just the index finger, slowly off the arm of the chair, we all froze wherever we stood, because it meant they were close. It was Esteban who first said we couldn't stay. He said it on the evening of the 6th day in Spanish, quietly, leaning toward me over the kitchen table in the candlelight so the kids in the other room wouldn't catch the weight of it before Marisol could soften it. His face in that light was all hollows, the candle throwing the shadows up under his cheekbones. And his good hand was flat on the table, and his bad one curled in his lap. He said the things in the street were thinning out, drifting east toward the river and the noise of something burning over there. But the houses around us were going to start drawing them back. He'd watched 2 of our neighbors die that afternoon through the gap in the curtains, the Hendels, who'd tried to make a run for their car. And he described it without any drama at all. The way the old man fell first and the woman stopped for him, which was the mistake. You cannot stop for anyone out there. And he said the smell of it, of fresh death, of blood in the open air, was a dinner bell. He said in 3 or 4 days our street would be the quietest place left, and quiet was the only thing that drew them more than sound. The empty places. They filled the empty places, he said, the way silt fills a still pool. I argued with him. Of course I did. I had water for a month if we were careful. I had the house sealed, the windows blacked out. I had a plan to wait it out and let the worst of it burn through the city and pass us by. He let me finish. He always lets you finish. That was a kind of respect he had. And then he said the thing that turned me. He said, "Wendell, you are a man who fixes what is broken. It is a good thing to be. But you cannot fix this with patience. This is not a fuse. This is a fire. You do not wait out a fire in a wooden house." And then he tapped the window glass, very lightly, once, with one fingernail, a sound so small I felt it more than heard it, and pointed. Across the street in the gray of dusk, 3 of them had stopped in the middle of the road. And here is the thing that put the cold in me. They were not shuffling. They had stopped, all 3, and turned their heads in the same direction at the same time, like compass needles swinging to north, toward the south, toward downtown. They stood there with their heads cocked at the same angle. And then they began to walk that way with a purpose I had not seen in them before. Not the aimless drift, the water-finding low-ground wander. A pull, a current in them, all 3 moving in step toward the same far thing. "Something is calling them," Esteban said, watching them go. "And whatever it is where we will have to go to leave. So we go now, before all of them hear it too, while the streets near us are still empty enough to walk." I didn't understand what he meant yet. I thought he was being a frightened old man, that the stroke had made him jumpy, that he was seeing patterns and randomness the way frightened people do. I want you to remember that I thought that, because I was wrong, and being wrong about it cost us, and the cost is the whole reason I'm telling you this. He saw me not believe him. He saw it on my face, and he didn't push. He just nodded, slow, and looked back out at the empty street, and let me come to it on my own, which I did, too late, the way I came to everything that week, too late. That night, by candlelight, with the windows blacked out with garbage bags and duct tape so no flicker would show to the street. I laid out everything I knew about the city on the kitchen table and tried to build a way out of it. I didn't have a real map. I had something better. I had 22 years of the city in my head, the real city, the one under the streets, every feeder line and pump station and where the right-of-way ran. Cedar Falls and Waterloo sit together on the Cedar River, two cities pretending to be one, with the river cutting through the middle and a handful of bridges stitching them together. We were on the Cedar Falls side, the west, in a neighborhood of older homes north of the university, big trees and deep lots. Getting out of the metro meant getting to one of two things. West, the highways heading out of the valley, which meant the interstate, US 20 and the Cloverleaf interchanges. And I knew with total certainty what those would be: a graveyard of stopped cars. The worst of the panic crystallized in steel. The kind of place where the living had died in their cars and gotten up still belted in. Or south and east, the small regional airport on the far side of the river. Going to the airport meant crossing the river. Crossing the river meant a bridge. And every instinct in me said a bridge was a trap. A narrow place with water on both sides and no way to turn around. So my first plan was the highway. West, out past the last subdivisions into farm country where the dead would be spread thin across 100 square miles of corn instead of packed into streets. Where a man could see trouble coming, a half-mile off, across flat ground. I had a route worked out. The back roads, the county roads, I'd driven my whole working life. I had it memorized down to the turns. I'd been driving these roads for 22 years, and I could have done it blind. The thing that destroyed that plan and turned us toward the river and the airport and eventually that stairwell was a sound on a radio that should not have existed. I had a hand-crank emergency radio, the kind everyone buys after a tornado scare and then forgets in a closet. A yellow plastic thing with a fold-out crank handle. The commercial stations were dead by the 6th night, every one of them. The dial just a smooth wall of static from one end to the other. The emergency broadcast loop on the NOAA weather band was still running. A recorded voice repeating the same instruction to shelter in place and await rescue, which by then was a cruelty, because there was no rescue and no one to shelter from the thing that was already inside the walls with you. That had maybe been your neighbor or your wife. I'd stopped really listening to it. But the 7th morning, cranking it up for the loop just to feel like the world still had a heartbeat somewhere, just to hear a human voice, even a recorded one, I turned the dial past the weather band by accident, my thumb slipping on the little wheel up into the higher frequencies where there shouldn't have been anything at all, and I caught a man's voice. It was not a recording. I knew it instantly. It had the texture of a live voice, breath in it, the small catches and rushes a recording doesn't have, fatigue dragging at the ends of the words. And what it was saying was a set of coordinates and a window of time. Hartman Field, South Ramp, civilian extraction, daylight hours only. Repeat, daylight hours only. The field is not secure after dark. We are running lift while we can. If you can reach the South Ramp at Hartman during daylight, you will be processed in order of arrival. We cannot hold the perimeter at night. Do not repeat, do not approach the main terminal. The terminal is lost. And then it cycled back to the start. Coordinates, instruction, warning. The same 80 seconds, looping, but with that breathing human texture varying a little each time a cough once, a place where his voice cracked on lost. And he had to start the word again. So I knew a man was sitting somewhere reading it over and over into a microphone instead of letting a machine do it. Which meant the machines were gone. Which meant whoever was lifting people out of Hartman Field was doing it the way I fixed power lines. by hand the old way, because there was no other way left. Hartman Field, the regional airport, south of Waterloo, on the far side of the river. I sat there at the kitchen table in the gray morning light with the radio in my hands, and I felt two things war against each other in my chest. One was hope, real hope. The first I'd felt in a week. There were planes, there were helicopters, there was a way out. There were people running it, organized people with a perimeter and a system. The other was the cold understanding that the way out led directly toward the thing I most wanted to avoid: the river, the bridges, the packed dead of downtown that the broadcast was unintentionally herding people toward, because every survivor with a working radio in 2 cities was hearing this same loop right now, and was about to start moving toward that same square of pavement on the far side of the water. That was what Esteban had felt the night before, watching them turn their heads in the street. Something is calling them. He'd been wrong about the mechanism and right about the truth in his bones. It wasn't a sound the dead could hear. They don't hear radios. It was a sound the living could hear. And the living, moving, would draw the dead behind them like a wake behind a boat, like iron filings behind a magnet dragged under paper. The broadcast was the magnet, and it was pulling everything, fast and slow, breathing and not, toward one square of pavement on the far side of the river. The 3 in the street had turned south because the living near them had already started moving south, hours before I'd even found the frequency. I told Marisol first, alone, in the kitchen, while the kids and Esteban still slept. She listened to the loop herself, twice, holding the little radio close to her ear, her face very still. She's not a person who cries easily. She'd held women through the worst hours of their lives and kept her voice level the whole time. But her hands shook holding that radio, a fine tremor I'd never seen in them. Hands that had threaded IVs into newborns. She asked the only question that mattered. She asked, quiet, not looking at me but at the radio, if I thought we could get all 5 of us across the river into that field during daylight. And I lied to her. Not a big lie, a small one, the kind you tell because the truth is too heavy to set down in front of someone you love at the wrong moment, before they've had coffee, before the day's even started. I said yes. I said I had a route, a way across that nobody else would know. I said we could do it. I did have a route. I thought about it for an hour before I woke her, sitting at that table while the gray light came up. The bridges downtown were out of the question, too narrow, too obvious, the exact kind of choke point where panic and the dead would meet and clot, where I'd be trapped on a span with my family and nowhere to go. But I knew something most people didn't, because I'd worked on it with my own hands, north of the city, where the river bent through a wooded stretch past the old industrial flats. There was a railroad bridge, a trestle. It carried a single line across the water on a high steel span, and it had a maintenance catwalk bolted to the downstream side, a narrow graded walkway with a single pipe rail, used by the rail crews and, twice in my career, by me, when the cooperative ran a feeder line across the river on the same right-of-way, and I'd had to inspect the conduit. It was not on any evacuation map because it wasn't a road, wasn't anything the public knew existed. The dead would follow the roads, and the living, and the noise. The trestle would be empty. From the trestle's east bank, we'd come out into the industrial flats, the old packing house and rail yard district. And from there, it was maybe 4 miles south to Hartman Field, through the kind of low, scattered, semi-rural edge of Waterloo where I gambled. The dead would be thinner feed stores and truck lots and rented houses with space between them, not the packed downtown core. 4 miles, with an 11-year-old asthmatic and a 73-year-old stroke survivor with a cane and a foot that wouldn't always answer him. That was the lie inside the lie. the one I told myself, and not just Marisol. I knew the trestle. I knew the route. I did not honestly know if Esteban could make it, or how, and I had not let myself finish that thought. I'd looked right at it and looked away, the way I'd looked away from him at the kitchen table when he tapped the glass. We decided to go on the 8th morning. We spent the 7th day and night preparing, and I'll tell you what we packed, because it mattered, every ounce of it, the way weight always matters when you're going to carry it on your back for miles. Water, as much as we could carry without slowing down, which after I'd loaded it onto everyone and made them walk. The hallway with it was less than I wanted. Water is heavy. A gallon is 8 pounds. And you feel every pound by the first mile. Food that needed no cooking and no fire and no smell. Protein bars, peanut butter, the trail mix from the camping bin, a bag of dried apricots Esteban insisted on, for some reason of his own. Tobias's inhaler, the blue rescue one, with maybe a dozen good doses left if I shook it and counted by the weight of it. And his maintenance inhaler, nearly empty. That I packed anyway. Esteban's blood pressure medication, what was left of it in the orange bottle. Because a man who'd had one stroke under no stress at all was a candle in a wind out there, and I knew the day would be nothing but wind. A first aid kit, the real one from the bathroom, and the supplemental one Marisol kept in her car. A pry bar and a heavy 4-cell flashlight, and a hatchet from the garage, which were my weapons, because I had nothing better. And I'd already understood that noise was death. So a gun, even if I'd owned a good one, was almost useless to us. One shot in that silence, and every dead thing for half a mile would turn its head toward us like those 3 in the street. Marisol took her trauma shears and a roll of gauze and 2 tourniquets she'd brought home from the hospital months ago and never returned, because she knew, better than any of us, exactly what kinds of injuries were going to happen and exactly how fast a person bleeds out from the femoral. And rope. I took 50 feet of static climbing rope I'd had in the truck for pole work, coiled in the back of the garage. I stood there with it in my hands and almost left it, because it was heavy and bulky, and I couldn't say exactly what I'd need it for. And weight was the enemy. I want you to remember the rope. I almost left it on the shelf. I put it over my shoulder at the last second, more out of a lineman's habit than any plan, the way you don't leave good rope behind. We dressed the kids in long sleeves and work gloves despite the warmth of the morning, because Marisol had figured out the thing the broadcast hadn't said, had reasoned it out from the EER cases. It moved through broken skin, through the bite and the deep scratch, the saliva in the wound, and bare skin was an open door. We wrapped our forearms with extra layers, duct-taped at the wrists, and ugly armor. We tied our shoes twice and tucked the laces in. We waited for first light, because the broadcast said daylight only, and the field was not safe after dark. And I had 8 or 9 hours of usable light to move 5 people 4.5 miles through a dead city. It should have been enough. On paper, sitting at that kitchen table doing the arithmetic, it was enough. 1 mile an hour through the careful parts and 2 through the open parts, rests for Tobias's chest, and we'd be at the fence by mid-afternoon with light to spare. On paper. Here is something I've thought about every day since. Esteban knew. When we gathered by the back door in the gray before dawn, all of us in our ugly taped armor with our bags on. He had his cane and 1 small bag, smaller than anyone else's, and nothing more. And I noticed it, and didn't let myself notice it. He caught my eye across the dim kitchen, and he held it. And there was no fear in his face at all. There was a kind of arithmetic. He had already done the math the radio man would do for me later. Hours and a river and a lifetime away. He had done it sometime in the night, alone, and made his peace with the answer. And he was only waiting to see if I'd do it too, or make him say it out loud. I looked away from him again. I told everyone to stay close, stay quiet, watch my hand. If my hand goes up, you freeze, no questions, you freeze. And I opened the back door onto a street I'd lived on for 16 years and did not recognize. The world outside was the color of a drowned thing. Gray light, gray sky, the sun not yet up over the houses, the lawns gone to seed and tall in just a week. Dandelions and crabgrass taking back the careful yards, a stillness that pressed on the ears like depth pressure. The air was wet and cool and carried that smell now, that sweet rotten smell, faint but everywhere, soaked into the morning. The dragging murmur I'd heard from inside the house was real and constant out here, and came from everywhere and nowhere at once. A tide just out of sight beyond the rooftops. Somewhere a wind chime turned in a breeze I couldn't feel. 3 soft notes, and the ordinariness of it was almost more than I could stand. We went out the back, through the gap in the cedar fence into the Kowalczyk's yard, where the kids used to cut through to the bus stop. And from there we worked north along the backs of the houses, keeping off the streets, moving through that strange seam of the world that runs behind everyone's fence, where the trash cans and the dog runs and the forgotten lawn chairs live. The unwatched country between properties. It was slower, but it was hidden. And hidden was everything. The first one we saw up close was a woman in a bathrobe standing in a garden between 2 houses, facing a fence, perfectly still, like a machine left running with nothing left to do. Esteban's hand went up. We froze, all 5 of us, mid-step, the way he'd drilled into us. The thing about them, the part the movies get wrong, is that they're not always hunting, not always lurching towards you with their arms out. Most of the time, they're just standing, swaying a little on their feet, waiting for a sound or a smell or a movement to give them a direction, to point them. The woman in the bathrobe didn't turn. I could see the back of her, the robe gone gray with filth, her bare feet in the dirt of the garden, one of her hands hanging at a wrong angle. And she just stood there, facing that fence, as if she were thinking about something. We went around her, one at a time, slow, Tobias's hand crushing mine, and she never knew we were there. I kept my eyes on her the whole way past, ready, and she never moved, and somehow that was worse than if she had. It took us 2 hours to cover the first mile, because we moved the way Esteban had taught us, in stillness and patience, freezing every time one of them drifted into the gap between houses, choosing the long way around every open space, every yard with a sight line. 2 hours of held breath, and the sun finally came up over the rooftops and burned the gray off. And the day turned warm and clear and beautiful in a way that felt obscene. And I started, against everything, to let myself believe. A mile down, the trestle, maybe 2 more, we were doing it. That was when Tobias started to wheeze. It came on the way it always did with him, slow then sudden, a tightening in the chest that I could hear before he could feel it, that turned his breaths into a thin, high whistle on the exhale. The pollen, maybe, all that gone to seed grass, or the dust, or the exertion, or the fear sitting on his chest like a hand. It didn't matter what triggered it. What mattered was the sound. In the dead silence of that ruined neighborhood, his breathing was suddenly the loudest thing for blocks. A high, reedy note that rose and fell with each breath, that carried over the fences, that announced us as clear as a bell. Here, living things, soft and warm. And here. I got him behind a parked van, down low, the four of us crowding him, and Marisol had the rescue inhaler out and the cap off before I could even ask. Her hands steady now in the way they got steady when there was a job to do, the tremor gone. She shook it, fitted it, told him low to breathe out all the way first, then pressed it as he breathed in, the soft chemical hiss of it, loud as a gunshot to my ears. One puff. She counted 10 in her head, watching his eyes, then gave him a second. It helped a little. I watched his shoulders come down a fraction and the relief flood his face. And it nearly broke me, that small relief, that ordinary boyhood relief in the middle of the end of the world. But the whistle was still there, underneath it, thinner, but there. And I looked up over the hood of the van and saw 2 of them, half a block down, standing in the street, turn their heads toward us in that slow compass needle way. We had to move, and we couldn't move fast, because fast meant deeper breaths, and deeper breaths meant more whistle, and more whistle meant more sound. And on ending a sudden, a death spiral with my son in the middle of it, the exact trap of him. The running that would save us was the thing that would kill him, and the kill him. Esteban, who could barely walk himself, came up on Tobias's other side and bent down close to the boy's face, his bad hand on the boy's shoulder, and murmured something to him, very low, right against his ear. I will never know exactly what he said. But I watched Tobias's breathing change. Not the asthma. The inhaler was working on that, the panic underneath the asthma, the fear that was tightening everything that the medicine couldn't reach. The old man talked my son's fear down to a place where the inhaler could do its work, the way he'd talked it down 100 times in the dark of the boys' room. And the whistle dropped to almost nothing. And we moved on, slow and low along the line of parked cars. And the 2 that had turned toward us lost the threat of us when we slipped behind a tall hedge and held still. And after a long, terrible minute, they drifted apart again, their heads swinging away, the current in them gone. If you've ever had to keep a frightened child quiet while something out there hunts the sound of his breathing, I genuinely want to know how you held yourself together. Because I'm still not sure how I did. Tell me where you're listening from, too. I find myself wondering who's out there, in the quiet, hearing this. In what city, in what kind of night? We reached the trestle a little after noon, coming down through a strip of cottonwoods and scrub onto the old rail right of way. The river there was wide and brown and high from the autumn rains, moving fast and silent the way deep, fast water does. The surface smooth and muscled and full of branches and one overturned aluminum boat that spun lazily in the current, caught for a moment in an eddy, then snagged on something below the surface and stayed, shuddering. The trestle crossed it on 6 tall concrete piers, the single rail line running dead straight across the top on its wooden ties and steel, and bolted to the downstream side, just as I remembered it, the maintenance catwalk, a steel-grated walkway maybe 30 inches wide, with a single pipe handrail at hip height on the outboard side, running the whole length of the span, perhaps 40 feet above the water. The steel was rust-streaked and weathered but solid. The cooperative didn't put men on anything that wasn't. It was empty. That part of my plan was exactly right, and I felt a flush of something almost like pride at it. God forgive me, the small, ugly pride of a man whose plan is working. The dead had no reason to be on a railroad bridge in the middle of nowhere. We had it entirely to ourselves, the wide brown river and the steel and the wind moving over the water, and nothing else. But I'd remembered the catwalk wrong in one respect. And the error landed on us all at once when we climbed the cinder embankment and stood at the foot of it, looking down its length. It was narrow, yes, 30 inches. I'd remembered that. what I'd forgotten or never properly registered when I'd crossed it twice. As a healthy man in a harness clipped to a lifeline with both hands free, was the open grating. You could see straight through the steel mesh of it to the river below, the whole way across. Every step you took, the brown water rushing 40 feet down, visible between your own feet, the river sliding past so that the bridge itself seemed to drift upstream when you looked at it too long. For me it was nothing, an old familiar nothing. For Pilar, who'd inherited her grandfather's stillness, it would be hard but doable. A matter of looking at the far end and not at her feet. For Tobias, with his chest still tight, it would be terrifying. But I could carry him across on my back if I had to. His arms around my neck. For Esteban, with a cane and a left foot that dragged and didn't always do what he told it to do, it was a death sentence, and we all knew it the moment we saw it. There was no carrying that man across 30 inches of open grating over a 40-foot drop. There was no walking him across, not with one foot he couldn't trust. He stood at the foot of the catwalk and looked down the length of it. That 40-foot drop visible through the grating the entire way, the river racing under it. And he did the math out loud. Finally, the way he'd been waiting to since the kitchen table, since the night before, maybe since the morning the world began to end. He said in English this time, so the kids would understand it and not just feel it. I can't cross that. Nobody answered him. The river filled the silence, that big, soft, rushing nothing. I started immediately, the way I always do, to solve it, because that's what I am. That's the whole shape of me, a man who looks at a broken thing and reaches for it. I said I'd carry him on my back. He weighed maybe 140 pounds soaking wet, and I'm a big man, 220, and most of it from 22 years of climbing and hauling, and I'd carried more than that up a 40-foot pole in spurs. He shook his head before I'd even finished saying it, slow, certain. He said if I carried him, and I slipped on that grating, both of us went into the river, 40 feet down into fast, cold water. And then his grandchildren had no father and no grandfather both. And he was not going to be the reason Tobias and Pilar lost 2 men in one fall. He said it flatly, evenly, like a man reading numbers off a gauge, no drama in it, which was how I knew he'd already thought it all the way through. I said I'd rig the rope then, run it across as a guideline, a hand line at chest height, clip him to it, and walk him over with my hands on him the whole way, the 2 of us moving together. And even if his foot caught, the line would hold him. And this is where the rope I almost left behind on the garage shelf earned its place in the story. Because it was the only thing that gave us even that much of a chance. I uncoiled it fast, my hands knowing the work without me having to think. I tied off one end to the steel of the trestle at the near bank, with a knot I'd trusted my own life to on 100 poles. I crossed first, alone, fast, my boots ringing soft on the grating, the river racing under me, the bridge seeming to slide upstream. And I tied the other end off at the far bank, pulling it as taut as I could get it by hand. A single line of rope at chest height running the length of the catwalk above the pipe rail. It wasn't a safety line in any real engineering sense. It would sag. It wouldn't truly catch a falling man. I knew that. It was something to hold. It was the difference between a man with a dragging foot, having one good handhold the whole way across, and having none at all. We sent Pilar across first, to get her to the safe side and to show her brother it could be done. She went with her jaw set and her eyes locked on the far bank. One hand sliding along my rope and the other on the pipe rail, stepping flat and careful. And she did not look down once, my brave girl. And she made it and turned around white-faced and waved her brother on. Then Marisol with Tobias gripped against her front, his face buried in her shoulder so he wouldn't see the water through the grate, both of them holding the rope, the steel ringing softly under their feet, past the 4-foot gaps between the piers where there was nothing under you at all but air and rope and river. They made it. They made it across, all 3 of them on the safe bank. And I stood at the near end with my father-in-law and the longest 40 feet of steel I have ever seen in my life. I put him in front of me. He left the cane leaning against the trestle at the bank because he needed both hands now. I had my hands on his hips, my chest against his back, my own grip on the rope reaching over his shoulder, both of us shuffling our feet flat along the grating, never lifting them, just sliding. We went 6 feet, 10, 12. I could feel his heart going through his back, fast and hard, and his breath coming quick and his good hand white on the rope. And then the dragging foot caught the raised lip where 2 sections of grating met, just a half-inch of steel. And he stumbled forward, and my heart stopped dead in my chest, and I clamped down on him with both arms and threw my weight back, and we held, both of us shaking, hard, the river loud and fast and patient below us, waiting. And then we heard it from the east bank, from the direction we were trying to reach, from the industrial flats where I'd gambled the dead would be thin. A sound, many of them. The dragging murmur, but close now, and growing, rising up over the noise of the river. And underneath it Pilar's voice from the far bank, low and tight, and trying very hard not to scream, and almost not managing it. "Dad! Dad! They're coming! There's a lot of them! Dad, hurry!" I didn't understand it then, standing frozen on that bridge with the old man trembling in my arms. I understand it now, completely. And it ties back to the broadcast, to the magnet, to the thing Esteban had felt in his bones 2 nights before, and I had called a frightened old man for. We were north of downtown, yes, away from the road bridges, exactly as I'd planned. But the railroad right-of-way that the trestle carried ran south on the far bank straight toward the heart of Waterloo, toward downtown, toward the river crossings where the dead were packed thickest, and toward Hartman Field beyond all of it. And the radio had been calling the living south all morning, every survivor with a working set. And the living had been moving south along every open path they could find. And the easiest open path on the east side of the river, the one clear, unobstructed corridor through all that wreckage, was the cleared, fenced, building-free strip of the railroad. They'd been funneling down it for hours, the living, walking the rail line south toward the field. And the dead had followed the living the way they always followed. And now the whole slow tide of both had reached the east end of the very bridge we were standing on, drawn up the corridor the way water finds the one open channel. We had not avoided the choke point. I had walked my family onto a steel bridge 30 inches wide, with a tide of the dead pooling at the far end of it and a stroke survivor halfway across. And there was no fast way forward and no way back that didn't put all 5 of us out on that catwalk at once, with no time and no daylight to spare. My clever route, my secret way that nobody else would know it, had fed us straight into the same current as everyone else, just from a different direction. This is the part where I have to slow down, because what happened in the next 90 seconds is the thing I carry every single day. And I owe it to you and to him to get it exactly right, every word of it. Marisol grabbed Pilar by the arm and pulled both kids back from the east end of the catwalk, back along it toward us, away from the dead that were now feeling their way onto the far end of the grating, which meant back toward me and Esteban in the middle, which meant all 5 of us were now strung out single file on a 30-inch walkway over a fast river with the dead arriving at one end of it. The dead can't cross a catwalk fast. They have no balance, no caution, no understanding of the drop. The first ones to step onto open grading over moving water tend to go off the side. You could see it even then. One of them lurching too far and dropping silently into the brown water below. Without a sound, without a cry, just gone. But they don't need to be fast. They never need to be fast. They only need to keep coming. And there was no end to them. And they were keeping coming, gripping the pipe rail with hands that didn't remember what hands were for, but gripped anyway. Lurching one slow step at a time out onto the steel. More behind them, more behind those. Esteban stopped trying to walk. I felt the decision go through his body before he made a sound, a kind of settling, a stillness. He turned around inside my arms, on that 30-inch span over 40 feet of fast water, slowly, so carefully, sliding his feet and gripping the rope until he was facing me, close, his face inches from mine. And he put one hand flat on my chest, over my heart. "Wendell," he said, "listen to me now, because there isn't time, and you're going to argue, and you can't. There's no room out here to argue. You'll put us both in the river." I told him to be quiet and turn back around and move. We'd go right now, the two of us. We'd make it. He didn't move. He kept his hand on my chest. He said, "The bridge is the only way to the field. They will come across it, slow, but they will keep coming, all day, all night. There is no end to them. You cannot get me across before they reach the children. And you cannot fight them on this catwalk and hold Tobias and hold Pilar at the same time. You know this. You have known it since the door this morning. You looked away from me at the door and at the table, and you have known it the whole way." I had. He'd watched me do it every time. He said, "There is a way for the four of you to live, and it needs the rope, and it needs me, and it needs you to stop being a man who fixes things for 1 minute and be a man who listens to me. Don't waste what I'm trying to give you by being stubborn. There isn't time for you to be stubborn." And then he told me his plan, fast, low, his hand never leaving my chest. And it was a good plan, an engineer's plan, the plan of a man who'd spent the morning and the night before doing arithmetic while the rest of us only hoped. The catwalk was bolted to the downstream side, narrow, single file. The dead would have to come across it one at a time, no other way. And they had no balance and no caution. One man, set at the right point on solid footing near the bank where the catwalk met the concrete, with something long to swing, could hold that line a long time, could put them off the edge into the river one at a time as they came. A hard shove or a low swing at the knees, and they'd go off the side, and the river would take them. Not forever. No man holds forever. But long enough. Long enough for 4 people to get off the bridge and onto the open ground and run. But it couldn't be me, he said, before I could even open my mouth to say it would be me. That I'd hold it and they'd take him across. It couldn't be me, because the 4 who ran needed me to lead them the last 4 miles to the field. The route was in my head and nobody else's. And they needed Marisol to keep them alive when the hurt came. And they did not need, he said it plainly, without any pity for himself, they did not need a 73-year-old man with half a body who couldn't cross a bridge. The man who held the line was going to die at it. Everyone on that catwalk understood that. And the man who held the line had to be the one whose death cost the family the least. And that arithmetic only ever came out one way. And he'd done it in his head before dawn. And he was only telling me the answer now because we'd run out of time for me to do it myself. He would hold the catwalk. I would tie him to the trestle so that no matter what happened to him out there, no matter how it ended, He could not be pulled off the side and carried downstream and turned into one more body coming for his grandchildren somewhere down the river. He would stand at the choke point on solid footing and put the dead into the water one by one for as long as his arms held out. And we would run, and we would not look back. I said no. I want you to know that I said no, out loud. And I meant it with everything in me. And I would have stood there on that bridge and argued it until the dead reached us and took us all. If Marisol hadn't done the one thing that could end the argument. She came back up the catwalk behind me, having gotten both children onto the solid ground of the far bank. And she put her body against my back so I could feel her there. And she reached past me and she put Tobias no. She put her hand on my arm, hard, fingers digging in. And she looked past my shoulder at her father. And the two of them had a conversation in about 4 seconds, with no words in it at all. The kind only two people who have loved each other for 40 years can have. A whole language of the eyes. And whatever passed between them, I will never be part of and never want to be. And then she said to me, in a voice I had never once heard her use in 18 years of marriage, a voice with all the air pressed out of it, flat and final as a closing door. He's right. And if you make him say goodbye to me twice, I will never forgive either of you. Not ever. Do you understand me? Don't make him do this twice. So there it was. I had 10 minutes. That was the number the radio man would echo back to me later that same day. A different 10 minutes. A crueler and a kinder one both. But it started here, on this bridge. I had maybe 10 minutes of daylight and bridge, and a tide coming up the grading, one slow step at a time. And a choice that wasn't a choice at all. Between carrying a man I loved to a death that would take all 5 of us into the river or onto the teeth of the dead, or leaving him to a death that would save the other 4. The whole rest of my life pivoted on a length of steel grating 30 inches wide. I tied him off myself. I will not let anyone else carry that. I will not pretend the rope tied itself, or that Marisol did it, or that there was no time, and it just happened. I did it with my own 2 hands. I unclipped the far end of my guideline and brought it back, and I wrapped the climbing rope around his chest, under his arms, and through the steel of the trestle at the bank where the footing was solid. And I cinched the knots the way 22 years of trusting my own life to knots had taught me. Snug and locked and certain, a harness that would not slip and would not come undone no matter how he was pulled. And the whole time my hands worked, he talked to me, low and steady and even, the calm in his voice holding mine together. He told me the route I already knew south along the flats, then cut west off the rail corridor before it carries you into the worst of it, then the high open ground all the way to the field. He told me Tobias would need the inhaler before the field for certain, the exertion, the dust, watch his shoulders. When the shoulders come up, he's struggling. He told me to keep Pilar talking the whole way, to make her answer me, because she goes silent when she's most afraid. And silence in that girl is the danger sign, not the noise. He told me things a father tells a son, which is what I was to him by then. What I'd become over 20 years without either of us ever saying it. And what he was to me, the father mine had never managed to be. I gave him the hatchet and the pry bar both, pressed them into his hands. He took only the pry bar, the long, heavy steel one. He pushed the hatchet back at me. He said the hatchet might bury itself in one of their skulls and stick fast, and then he'd be out there with nothing but a long steel bar he could swing all day, and it would never stick in anything. Just break and shove and sweep them off the edge. He was right. He was right about every single thing, all morning, all week, and I had called him a frightened old man inside my own head. And I will carry that too, along with everything else, for the rest of my life. The last thing he said to me, with the first of the dead maybe 30 feet down the catwalk and lurching closer one slow grip and step at a time, was not goodbye. He'd already said his goodbye to Marisol with his eyes, and he would not say it to the children at all, would not let them carry the moment of it. To me he said this, he said, "When you get them to the field, and they tell you the numbers don't work, and they will tell you that, Wendell, the numbers never work at the end of a thing like this. There is always one too many. You remember that I already made one of the numbers smaller for you. Today. With my own hands. You don't have to do it again. You hear me? You already paid. Don't pay twice." I didn't understand it then. I had no idea what he meant. I thought it was the last strange wisdom of a man saying his last words. The kind of thing the dying say that the living puzzle over. I understood it completely about 6 hours later, in the stairwell of a parking garage, with a radio in my hand, and a man's tired voice telling me, "The bird seats 4, and there are 5 of you." And I can't change the math. But there weren't 5 of us anymore. There were 4. He'd made the number smaller. He had looked at the whole shape of the day before any of it happened. And he had known, the way he knew everything, that it would end with someone counting seats. And he had reached forward through the entire rest of that terrible bleeding day and taken that cup out of my hands before I ever had to lift it to my lips. I told Pilar and Tobias to run to their mother on the far bank and not look back at their grandfather. And to my shame and my everlasting gratitude, they obeyed me. They ran. Though Pilar's face, when she understood, and she understood, she was 16 and sharp, and she understood exactly, is a thing I see in the dark sometimes. We ran. God help me, the 4 of us ran east off that bridge onto solid ground and into the industrial flats. And behind us, I heard the first heavy clang of steel on bone, the pry bar finding its first work, and the wet, heavy sound of a body going off the catwalk into the river. And then another clang, and another splash, and Esteban's voice, not screaming, never screaming, calling out numbers, counting them off as they came to him. And as he put them into the water, 1, 2, 3, the way he must have counted things his whole long life, to keep his hand steady through whatever those years in the South had been. And the river took each number as he gave it up. And we ran east into the maze of the flats, and I did not look back, because looking back would have cost a second. And he had bought those seconds with everything he had and everything he was, and I would not waste a single one of them turning my head. We made it into the flats, into the old packing house district, a labyrinth of brick warehouses with broken windows and rusted rail sidings and loading docks gaping open like mouths. Weeds coming up through the cracked concrete. The dead on the east end, the ones that had pooled at the bridge, were thinner than they'd looked from out on the catwalk. Most of that tide had been the slow drift down the rail corridor. And the moment we cut sideways off the corridor into the tangle of empty buildings and sidings, away from the open line, the pressure eased like stepping out of a current into slack water. I could still hear the bridge behind us for a long time, longer than I'd have thought possible. The clang and the splash and the counting carrying over the flats, getting fainter as we put brick walls between us and the river. And then at some point, I couldn't hear the counting anymore. Only the clang of steel, slower now, more spaced out. And then at some point, I couldn't hear the clang either. And I made myself keep moving, keep leading, because the alternative was to stop and stand still and understand what the silence meant. Pilar was the one who said it. We'd stopped behind a derailed boxcar, a great rusted hulk lying half on its side. To let Tobias's chest settle and to make sure nothing had followed us off the corridor, all four of us crouched in the boxcar's shadow with our backs to the cold steel. And Pilar, my daughter, who goes quiet when she's most scared, did not go quiet. She said in a tiny flat voice that was worse than any scream, "He stopped counting." And Marisol pulled her in against her chest and put one hand on the back of her head and held her there and said, "I know, mija, I know, I know." And that was all any of us said about it then. Because grief is a thing that needs space and time to do its work, and we had neither. We had 4 miles still and maybe 5 hours of daylight burning down. And a sun with a tightening chest and a promise made to a dying man to keep 4 numbers alive all the way to a field on the far side of the city. So we breathed, and we drank a little water. And Marisol checked Tobias's chest with her ear against his back, and I checked the angle of the sun. And then I stood up and said we had to move. And we moved. The 4 miles from the flats to Hartman Field were the longest of my life. And I'm going to take you through them, because the day was not done with us, not by a long way. And the cruelest part of it hadn't even started yet. The industrial flats gave way as we worked south and west to the ragged southern edge of Waterloo, the part of any city where the warehouses thin out into truck stops and feed stores and farm equipment dealers and low-rented houses with chain-link yards. Except the dogs that should have been in those yards were gone or dead or worse. And the houses stood open, front doors hanging, screens torn, the ordinary wreckage of a place where everyone had left in a hurry or hadn't left at all. Esteban had been right that the dead were thinner out here, spread across more ground. But thinner is not the same as gone, and we'd lost our quiet master, the man who could read a street the way I could read a panel. And now, when I had to be him, there was no one else to do it. So I made myself slow down, even though every nerve in my body screamed to run flat out for that field, because running is exactly how the careful die. And I owed it to Esteban to be careful, to be worth the thing he'd just done. I learned fast, in the doing of it, the things he had known by instinct. I learned to watch the birds, because where there were no birds at all, where a whole block stood silent of even the sparrows, there was something the birds wouldn't go near. I learned to listen for the flies, which had begun to gather around the dead in great droning curtains in the warm afternoon, so that sometimes you could hear a thing a half block off, that thick, wet buzzing before you ever saw it, and root around it. I learned that the dead pooled in the low places and the shaded places, the underpasses and the alley mouths and the deep porches, and stood thinner on the open high ground, in the sun. And so I routed us along the open high ground, the crowns of the streets, even though it left us exposed. Because exposed and aware beats hidden and surprised every time, every single time. Twice we had to fight, and I'm not going to dress it up or skip over it, because the people who tell you survival out there was all cleverness and never violence are lying to you, or were never really in it. The first time, one came around the corner of a feed store right into us. No warning. Fast they can move fast, when they have a target right in front of them. The slow drift is only for when they're searching a young man in a delivery driver's uniform, the company patch still on his shirt, with most of his lower jaw gone so that his tongue worked obscenely in the open ruin of it. And there was no avoiding him, no time to root around. He was on us, reaching for Pilar, who was nearest. I put the hatchet into the side of his head, hard, both hands, the way you'd drive a wedge into green wood. And the sound it made, and the give of it, and the way he dropped all at once like a puppet with the strings cut, are things I will spare you the rest of. I had to put my boot on his shoulder to work the hatchet free. Pilar didn't make a sound. She just stared at the body, and then at me, and then she took her brother's hand, and we kept moving. And I've never been prouder of anyone, and never wished harder that a child of mine had not had to see what she saw. The second time there were 3 of them, too many to fight with a hatchet and my family at my back. And so we ran, and I used the buildings the way Esteban had taught me to use. Everything. Leading the 3 of them into the dead-end loading court of a self-storage place, a concrete box with one way in, and then doubling us back out through a gap in the chain link I'd clocked on the way past. I'd noticed it, that was the thing. I'd been watching for exactly that kind of gap the whole time, becoming the man I needed to be, one observation at a time, and we slipped out through the fence while the 3 of them piled into the dead end behind us, milling, confused, clawing at the back wall and at each other. And we left them there and put distance between us and that buzzing, droning afternoon. Cleverness and violence both. You needed both out there. Anyone who tells you it was only ever one or the other died early, or is lying, or never left their house. The whole way, mile after mile, I kept the broadcast running in my head like a metronome. Daylight only, daylight only. The field is not secure after dark, and I kept checking the sun, and the sun kept dropping, sliding down the western sky faster than seemed fair. And the math kept getting tighter and tighter in my head. We'd lost too much time on the bridge. We'd lost time fighting and routing and waiting for Tobias's chest to open back up. Twice more it had closed on him, twice more the inhaler. And I was counting those doses now, down to 7, 6. By the time the chain link perimeter and the orange windsock standing out stiff in the evening breeze and the low cluster of buildings of Hartman Field came into view across one final open field of dead brown grass. The sun was a hand's width above the western horizon and going fat and red and swollen the way it does at the very end of the day. And I knew with a cold and total certainty that we were going to reach that fence right at the bleeding edge of the dark the broadcast had warned us not to be caught in. And the field was chaos. I'd pictured something orderly. All the long miles, I'd let myself picture it to keep my feet moving. The man on the radio had said processed in order of arrival. And from those words, I'd built a picture in my head of a line, a checkpoint, a folding table, soldiers with clipboards, a system holding firm. And there was a system. You could see the ghost of one. The bones of where one had been a fenced staging area near the south ramp. A couple of military trucks parked to form a barrier, men in uniform with rifles up on the truck beds. But it had been overwhelmed. The way every system in that whole collapse got overwhelmed, all at once, after holding far longer than anyone had a right to expect it to. There were hundreds of people pressed up against that south fence in the red evening light. The broadcast had called the living from 2 whole cities, and the living had come, all of them, all day, walking and limping and carrying their children and their old people. And now they were stacked 10 deep against a chain-link fence in the last light of the day. And out at the edges of that great desperate crowd, drawn by the noise and the smell and the press of all that warm life in one place, the dead were beginning to gather. The way the flies had gathered at the edges of the dead all afternoon. The magnet had done its work. Everything in 2 cities had come to this one square of pavement, the living and the dead both. And now they were meeting. I could see beyond the fence. The thing we'd crossed a river and lost a man and killed strangers to reach. A helicopter. One helicopter, sitting on the concrete of the south ramp, its rotors turning at idle, a civilian-marked medevac bird, white and orange, and men loading people into it in fistfuls, hauling them up bodily, and the obvious unbearable arithmetic of it hit me in the chest like a physical blow. One helicopter, hundreds upon hundreds of people, and the dark coming down out of the east like a lid closing. We did not go to the fence. I knew better than to go to the fence the instant I saw it. The fence was death. A crush of hundreds of panicking people with the dead working the edges of the crowd is the single worst place on earth to bring two children. The place where you get separated, where you get trampled, where the panic itself kills more than the dead do. I pulled my family back, hard, into the lee of a low-maintenance building at the field's outer edge, out of sight of the crowd and the fence, behind a corrugated steel wall, to stop and breathe and think for the few seconds we had. And it was there, in those few seconds, pressed against that steel wall in the red light, that I found the thing that gave us our one chance and our final terrible choice both. Bolted to the wall of that maintenance building, in a weatherproof gray steel box with a hinged lid, was a field telephone. Not a radio, a hardwired handset on a coiled cord, the kind that connects a remote building to a central office over a buried copper pair, the kind nobody under 50 even recognizes anymore. I knew exactly what it was the second my eye fell on it, because I'd run lines exactly like it to substations and well houses and remote pump facilities my whole working life. The old reliable copper that doesn't care about anything. It was a direct line, almost certainly, to the airport operations office, to wherever the man with the breathing voice was sitting reading his loop into a microphone, because the field telephone and the broadcast set would both terminate in the same ops room. That's how these fields were wired. And a hardwired copper pair doesn't care about the radio chaos, or the jammed channels, or the 1,000 desperate people screaming into handsets at the fence. If the line was live, I could talk directly, privately, to the people running the lift, while everyone else screamed into the dark. The line was live. I want you to understand how rare and how lucky that was, and how much it was the product of the exact man I happened to be, standing in the exact spot my whole life had trained me to understand. 100 other men would have walked past that gray steel box without a single glance, would have seen nothing but a junction box, and 100 other men's families would have died at that fence in the dark. I cranked the little handle on the side, the magneto, the way you ring an old field set, and I put the handset to my ear. And I got a dial tone, a buried, healthy, humming dial tone. The most beautiful sound I had heard in 9 days of the end of the world, and then a click, and a voice, exhausted past exhaustion, suspicious, sharp. Ops, who is this? This line's supposed to be dead. Who's on this line? I told him who I was. Fast, low, everything in a few breaths. A lineman, 22 years with the cooperative. 4 people. One of them a kid with asthma, one a teenage girl. At the maintenance building on the east edge of the field, the one with the copper drop. I told him I knew this field's infrastructure. I knew where the lines ran, the power and the water both. I could be useful to him, genuinely useful, if he could get my family onto a bird. I was trading. It was the only thing I had left to trade. It's who I am, in the end. When everything else is stripped away, a man who knows the system under the skin of things, offering that knowledge for the lives of the 4 people I had left in the world. And the man on the other end was quiet for a long second. I could hear him breathing, the same breathing I'd heard on the loop, the same tired man. I could hear, behind him, the rotor noise and someone shouting numbers. And then he said, gentler than he'd started, because exhaustion had burned everything but the truth out of him. I can put you on the last bird tonight. It's the last one, you understand me. It's lifting in 10 minutes. It has to clear the field before full dark, or we lose the whole crew. The perimeter's already going. We can't hold it after dark." "But sir, I have to be straight with you, because there's no time left to be anything but straight. The bird seats 4. With my pilot and my loadmaster aboard, that's 2. That leaves 4 seats, and I'm holding them right now with my own body. 4 seats. You said 5 of you." I said 4. I said, "There's 4 of us." And he heard something in how I said it, some weight or break in the 2 words. And he said it again, gentler still. But he said it twice. The thing I told you at the very start. The thing that wakes me at 3 in the morning, 11 months later. 4 seats, sir. If there's 5 of you, I can't change the math. I'm sorry. God knows I'm sorry. I can't change the math. There's 4 of us, I said again, into that handset, with the rotors turning beyond the wall and the dark coming, and my family's faces turned up to me in the red light. There's 4 of us. I had said it 3 times now, and meant it every time. And it was true, and it was the most terrible truth I have ever spoken into anything. Because the reason there were only 4 of us standing in the lee of that steel building was that a man on a bridge 4 miles and 6 hours behind me had heard this exact moment coming, had seen it whole from the foot of a catwalk before any of it happened, and had reached forward through the entire long bleeding length of that day to make the number small enough that I would never, ever have to choose. Don't pay twice. You already paid. He'd known, standing on that bridge with the river racing under him and the dead lurching toward his grandchildren. He had known there would be a helicopter at the end of it, and a number, and a tired man saying the math doesn't work. The math never works at the end. Because he had lived through enough endings, in whatever country and whatever years he never spoke of, to know exactly how they end. With someone, somewhere, counting seats, counting places in the boat, counting who fits and who doesn't. And he had not wanted his daughter to watch her husband choose. He had not wanted Marisol to choose between her own father and her own children. He had not wanted me to carry the weight of subtracting one of us in the last 10 minutes. So he had taken the choice and made it his own. Alone on a bridge, with a length of rope and a steel bar, an account he kept until his arms gave out. So that when this moment came, and he had been certain that it would come, the math would already be done. Already solved. 4 seats, 4 of us. He'd balanced the equation himself, with his own body, hours before I knew there was an equation. I stood there with that handset against my ear, and the dial tone humming under the man's voice, and 10 minutes draining away into the dark. And I understood, finally, completely, all of it. What he had given me. He had not simply sacrificed himself to buy us time on a bridge, though he'd done that too. He had done something harder and more deliberate and more loving than that. He had looked at the whole shape of the day before the day happened, read the sequence of it the way I read the sequence of a failing grid, seen exactly where it had to end, and arranged it with his own hands and his own death, so that the people he loved would never have to carry the one weight he could see coming for them. The cruelest arithmetic in the world, the choosing of who lives. And he had done it in his head before dawn, in the candlelight of my kitchen, and made his peace with the answer. And then waited all morning, all the way to that bridge, only to see if I would force him to say it aloud or have the grace to let him do it in silence. I told the ops man we were coming, the 4 of us, right now. He told me how to reach the south ramp without going through the killing crush at the main fence, a service gate on the east side, behind my maintenance building, that he'd send 2 men to open for exactly 30 seconds and not 1 second more. And I had to be at it, all 4 of us, the moment it opened. I hung the handset back on its hook in the gray steel box, slow, and I turned to my family in the red dying light. I gathered them in close, and I told them, fast, low, that there was a way, that the last bird was lifting in minutes, that there was room, that we had to run for a gate the moment it opened. The four of us, together, no stopping, no matter what. And Pilar, my sharp-tongued, brave, terrified daughter, who goes silent when she is most afraid, who had not gone silent even on the bridge, looked up at me and said it. Not a question, a reckoning, laid down flat between us. She said, 4 of us. I said, 4 of us. He made sure of it. And I watched her understand it all over again, the full shape of it. What her grandfather had done on that bridge, that he had done arithmetic with his own death so that the 4 remaining would fit, exactly, in a helicopter he could not have known the size of, but had known the existence of, the way he'd known everything. Her chin came up. Her eyes were dry now. She took her brother's hand in hers, hard, and she nodded once at me. And in that nod, she told me that she knew, and that she would carry it, the way I carry it, the way Marisol carries it, all of us carrying our piece of the same impossible gift for the rest of our lives. We ran. The service gate in the east fence opened on a count, exactly as the ops man had promised. 2 men in uniform hauling the chain link section back on its rollers, and we went through into the staging area in the last red minutes of the daylight, past the killing crush at the main fence, past the rifles and the trucks and the terrible sea of faces who would not be getting onto any helicopter tonight, who would be on that field when the dark came and the perimeter failed. And I will not pretend to you that I didn't see those faces, or that I don't see them still. Hundreds of them, mothers and old men and children, turning toward the 4 of us as we ran past with our impossible 4 seats. The bird's rotors were spinning up now, the downwash flattening the dead brown grass and tearing at our clothes and our hair. And Tobias's chest seized hard in the rotor wash, the dust and the wind closing his airway. And Marisol had the rescue inhaler in his mouth before he could even gasp out the word for it. 1 dose, 2, her hands sure, and the loadmaster, a young man, no older than 25, with eyes that had aged 100 years in 9 days, reached down out of the open door and hauled the kids up first. Tobias, then Pilar, and then Marisol, and then me last. My boots leaving that field. And he counted us as we came aboard, the same way Esteban had counted the dead off the bridge into the river. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then he hauled the door shut and locked it, and slapped the bulkhead twice, and shouted something to the pilot I couldn't hear over the rotors. We lifted off Hartman Field into the dark we had been warned about all day, lifting up into it exactly as it fell. The last light bleeding out of the west, and below us, as the bird climbed and banked, the whole eastern edge of the field went dark and started to move. The perimeter breaking apart just as the tired man on the radio had said it would, just as he'd known it would. The dead flooding in across the fence line at last. And the last thing I saw of the ground, of that whole drowned, dying valley where I had lived my entire life, was the sea of faces at the main fence turning up toward us as we rose away. Hundreds of them, pale in the rotor wash and the last red light, watching the only helicopter lift off and carry away 4 people who had reached it across a river and through a dead city and over the body of a man who had counted the dead into the water one at a time so that his grandchildren could fly out of the dark. I never learned the ops man's name. There wasn't time. There was never time. And the bird was loud. And then it was over. I never properly thanked the young loadmaster with the old eyes. I never went back across that river, and I never will. The cooperative is gone. The city is gone, drowned in the dark we flew up out of. The trestle is still there, I'm told, by people who've flown over it since the rail bridge, over the brown water north of where Cedar Falls used to be, standing on its 6 concrete piers over the fast water. And somewhere on the steel of it, if anyone ever climbs up to look, there's a length of static climbing rope tied off in a lineman's knot, cinched around the trestle and around nothing now. The knot I tied with my own 2 hands around a man's chest, while he told me, calm and even, how to keep his grandchildren alive on the road ahead. We made it to a relocation site in Nebraska, and from there, eventually, to a small town further west where the dark never reached, where there are fences that hold and water that runs, and a school the kids go to. The kids are alive. Tobias has a better inhaler now, a real prescription, a steady supply. And his chest is better than it ever was in that wet river valley. Pilar talks more than she used to, talks instead of going silent, fills the quiet up on purpose. And I take that as the one thing her grandfather would have wanted most for her. That she learned to make noise in the safe places. Marisol and I don't talk about the bridge. We talk all the way around it, the way you walk around a hole in the floor in a dark room. But sometimes, late, lying awake, she'll say a number out loud into the dark of our room. Just a number, no words around it, 1 or 3 or 7. And I'll know she's hearing him out there on the catwalk, counting. And I'll put my hand on the back of her head the way she put hers on Pilar's, behind that boxcar. And we'll lie there in it together, the 2 of us, until the number lets her go. I've gone over it 10,000 times. Whether I should have refused him outright, planted my feet on that bridge and carried him across no matter what, and somehow held the line too, and saved every one of us. Whether a better man, a stronger man, a faster man, would have found the third way that I couldn't see. I don't think such a man exists. I've looked for him in my head 1,000 nights, and I can't find him. But I've spent a great many of those nights being angry that I'm not him. Being angry at the river and the bridge and the broadcast and the math. Being angry at a tired stranger on a radio for telling me a truth. A dead man had already spent his life to spare me. And every single time, I come back around to the same place. Which is the thing Esteban said to me with the dead 30 feet down the catwalk, and closing that I had already paid. And I did not have to pay twice. He took the cruelest choice in the world out of my hands before I even knew it was coming for me. I don't know, even now, whether that makes me a lucky man or a hollow one. Maybe it makes me both. Maybe out here, after everything, those are the same thing. If you've stayed with me all the way to here, you've carried something heavy the whole way, and I'm grateful for it. Genuinely. More than I can say. So I'll ask you the one question I have never once been able to stop asking myself. And you can tell me what you think, because I truly want to know, from wherever you are. If you had been the one standing on that bridge, with a man you loved in your arms, and a tide of the dead coming up the grading 1 step at a time, and 4 people on the far bank who needed you to get them home, would you have let him do it? Could you have tied that knot with your own hands? Or would you have stayed out there and argued and gone into the river together and called that love? I tied the knot. I will never be entirely sure that I was right. But there are 4 of us, alive, in a town the dark never reached. And there are 4 of us because there was a 5th. And he made the number smaller with his own 2 hands so that none of the rest of us would ever have to. That's the whole of it. That's everything that happened on the day I had 10 minutes to choose between my family and the last helicopter out of a dying city. The truth I couldn't say out loud for 11 months, is that the choice had already been made for me. Hours before I ever picked up that handset, on a steel bridge over a brown river, by a man who loved us enough to do the cruelest arithmetic in the world alone, in silence, so that we would never have to. His name was Esteban Reyes. He had a stroke the spring before the world ended and dragged his left foot and could not cross a bridge. He counted to somewhere past 30 before his arms gave out and the river took the last number from him. And I have spent every single day since trying, and mostly failing, and trying again, to be a man worth what he paid.